Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Part 1. The Seditious Genius of the Spiritual Penis of Jesus. How Christianity's subversion of kin-selective altruism evolved into the modern idea of social progress. Christian family values. Some are more equal than others in God's kingdom. In the ancient world, it would have been considered natural that Rome rule in victory, and Jews be oppressed in defeat. It also would have been considered natural that Jews claim their status as God's chosen people, and rebel against Rome's usurpation of God's rule. Is this what Jesus did? Was he simply more radical than others in his rebellion against Rome? In the classical revolutionary paradigm, Romans arrogate on top, Jews suffer at the bottom, and the latter wields a moral indictment to incriminate the evil imperialists in the eyes of God. The existence of a rape in the Galilee, however, presented the world with something very different. In the person of Jesus, to the extent of his half-Roman ancestry, the Roman now suffered at the bottom. To the extent of Jesus's half-Jewish ancestry, the Pharisees were like Romans who arrogated on top. The tables had been turned. Jesus fomented, not a classical spiritual revolution against Rome, but a revolution from below. The revolution turned the world of Rome upside down by extension of turning the world of the Pharisees upside down. Jesus, in other words, judged the Jews judging Rome. Every Jewish criticism of Rome, when judged by the way he was treated, became grounds for radicalizing beyond Judaism. How will the Jews, amidst their own struggle against Roman oppression, treat a half-Roman Jewish orphan abandoned and socially helpless in a violent world? In the classical conservative paradigm of this ancient world, to be of pure Roman blood was to be first in the world. To be of part Roman blood in Roman-occupied Israel, however, was to be last in the world. The very existence of Jesus demonstrated that the meaning of Roman ancestry was utterly relative. Intuitive realization of this racial relativism left Jesus with a profound lack of faith in this world. The extent to which Jesus lost faith in this world is the extent to which he could be called a nihilist. Jesus could not believe in a Judaism that defined itself as anti-Romanism because he saw something of the same anti-Romanism directed against himself. In this way, pity for himself at the bottom simultaneously provoked empathy with Caesar at the top. Yet as a half-Jew, his hatred of Caesar at the top could only be quenched if Caesar took Jesus's place at the bottom. Out of hatred for the entire world, Jesus turned the entire world upside down. One of the most famous radicalism of the New Testament is Jesus's prophecy that the last will be first, and the first will be last, i.e. Matthew 20:16. In his world, Caesar was first and Jesus was last. Jesus put his faith in a world in which he, Jesus himself, would be first and Caesar would be last. In God's kingdom, he believed, both Rome and the Pharisees would have their worlds turned upside down. This was not pure altruism. This was the spiritual logic of Jewish moralism radicalized to usurp the authority of both Rome and the Pharisees. The unique justice of his authority arose from being both Roman and Jew. It is also inescapable that Jesus believed that he was closer to God in that crisis of Roman occupation because he embodied a more godlike, impartial perspective beyond the partial perspectives of both Jews and Romans. This does not mean, however, that one can assume that Jesus, the exorcist of demons, possessed an entirely more impartial perspective than his contemporaries did. According to the Gospel of Matthew, then they brought to him a demoniac who was blind and mute, and he cured him, so that the one who had been mute could speak and see. All the crowds were amazed and said, "Can this be the son of David?" But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, "It is only by Beelzebul, the ruler of demons, that this fellow casts out the demons." He knew what they were thinking and said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and no city or house divided against itself will stand." Matthew 12:22-25. Jesus knew what they were thinking. But what were they thinking? Were they thinking that Jesus was a freak cursed by his demonic, evil, Roman, rapist blood? Were they thinking that he was trying to cure others of the demons that he himself possessed? There was, as Crossan pointed out, a symbolic psychosocial relationship between Jesus's exorcism of demons and the colonial oppression of the Romans. Mark 5, verses through 17 portrays the story of Jesus exorcising a demon that calls itself Legion, the symbol of Roman power. The exorcised spirits, in this story, were cast onto swine, the most impure of animals in Judaism, and then cast into the sea. Crossan considers this individuated symbolic revolution. In this way, a vision of revolution against Rome could be internalized as the expulsion of the demon of a Roman legion. Did not those legions possess and penetrate his mother with their demonic seed? The crowd raised the question of Jesus' ancestry: can this be the son of David? There would no need to argue that the Messiah does not need to be a son of David, Mark 12, 35-37, if it were not clear that he could not claim this ancestry. The Bethlehem birth story in Matthew and Luke was very likely fabricated to help support the fabrication of a Davidic ancestry. The obsessive refrains of the Son of Man and the Son of God comes out of a dialectical argument wherein doubts about Jesus' status as a Jew lead to increasingly radical counterarguments for the primacy of faith in his status as a child of God. Jesus answered that he was not a house divided between Judaism and Romanism, God and Satan. The question of the house divided was answered in his affirmation that, through the Spirit of God, he was undivided in his devotion to the kingdom of God over the kingdom of Satan. Quote, "If Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? But if it is by the Spirit of God that I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come to you. Or how can one enter a strong man's house and plunder his property, without first tying up the strong man? Then indeed the house can be plundered. Whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters." Matthew 12, 26-30. Did Jesus become an expert in exorcism through a search for answers against the accusation that he himself was possessed by demons, inherited from his Roman rapist father? Did he command the unclean spirits within himself with the power of faith? Was Jesus subtly conveying the idea that he tied up the Roman demons within himself and plundered their property? Is this how he attempted to prove that he was truly on the side of the God of Abraham and not on the side of the Roman enemy in a spiritual sense? After all, if there was serious doubt about which side Jesus was on, how could the Nazarene expect anything different? What did Jesus expect the Jews to do? Love their enemies. Jesus was weak. He was weak in a strictly political sense. Look at Jesus from a totally political perspective. Whose side was he on? Was he on the side of Israel or on the side of Rome? Who was friend and who was enemy for a man born half Jewish and half Roman in the middle of a Roman/Jewish war? If the political rests on the distinction between friend and enemy, then Jesus's politics had to be beyond the politics of his world. From this perspective, it becomes clear why there existed no middle or moderate ground for Jesus. Jesus was compelled to be radical because the attempt to live upon a precarious middle ground would leave him a house divided, a potential spiritual or political fifth column of the evil empire of Rome. In the context of polarized resistance to Rome, Jesus's very being straddled across a spiritual no man's land. Christianity's radicalism was born of the need to overcome the condition of being house divided, and emerge unambiguously on the side of God. You cannot, at the same time, serve two masters, i.e. Gospel of Thomas 47:2, and this is what compelled Jesus's end-time logic. If there was no middle ground, then what was true for Jesus was inevitably true for anyone who attempted to follow him: whoever is not with me is against me. It was the Pharisees, he implied, and not him, that were sitting on the fence with their unending doubt in his goodness. Jesus found wholeness against claims that he was a house divided in the vision of a singular kingdom of God. Against the claim that he was the son of a demon or the son of Satan, he countered that he was the son of God. Against the claim that he was an illegitimate child, Jesus countered that the Pharisees were illegitimate children. He turned the Pharisaic claim that he was house divided around into the claim that Jews are a house divided, part material, part spiritual. The spiritual totalitarianism of the kingdom of God was compelled out of radicalization of the spirit of the law. And who could fulfill the law in this way except the hope for Messiah? In this way, Jesus's radical messianic claims were compelled against accusations, reservations, or presumptions that only half measures could be expected of a half-Jew. After all, why did Jesus not join unambiguously on the side of revolution against Rome? Doubt arising from the inherent ambiguity of his case, compelled Jesus's need for faith in him. His willingness to die on the cross was the ultimate proof of his unwillingness to compromise with the ways of the world. Mary Magdalene is described as one out of whom went 7 demons, Luke 8, 1-3. Now if Mary Magdalene was historically identical to Jesus's mother Mary, a literary identity meant to purify the identity of Jesus's mother by expelling her whore identity onto a separate character, then this means that Jesus may have performed an exorcism on his own mother. The reason would be plain enough: the source of her impurity and whore identity was the physical penetration of her body as possessed by demonic Roman legions. The exorcism would have amounted to the attempt to expunge the unclean spirits of the rapist, or rapists, from her body, exorcising the unclean spirits of a whore identity from Mary onto the invented character of Mary Magdalene was how this exorcism was effected in the Christian canon. This faith healing through love may have been the paradigm for future faith healings. Jesus's Roman, rapist blood was probably considered impure like a biological disease. If his blood was unpurifiable on a bodily level, his purity could only be purely spiritual. For this reason, when he attempted to heal the sick or exorcise demons, its meaning was almost certainly spiritual and not biological. This is the plane Jesus had to live on to transcend the sin of his biological existence through rape. Yet if Jesus knew the demons, Mark 1:32-34, how could he cure himself of them? It seems he turned his demonic energy towards service to God, and this compelled his striking sense of mission. Jesus was socially outside the pale of exclusionary Roman aristocracy, and socially outside the pale of the temple elite who sat in Moses' seat. At the margins of both Rome and Israel, he was socially marginalized beyond both extremes. By the rules of his world, he should be dead. His entire standpoint is that of one pushed towards social death outside of human society. If rape was fairly widespread during the violent Roman repression of Jewish revolts around 4 BCE, then it is very likely that Jesus was not the only child born of rape at that time. It is quite likely that many half-Roman/half-Jewish children were born around the same time as Jesus in the greater area in which he grew up. These were the lost sheep of Israel. There is no reason to think that half-Jewish/half-Roman descent, in itself, produces someone like Jesus. The personalities of such half-breeds would have been as varied as any other population. It may be the case that Jesus became Jesus, in part, because his Jewish family rejected him while other half-Jews/half-Romans were accepted by their families. The half-Jews/half-Romans who were products of rape, and yet were accepted in love by their Jewish families, are the ones lost to history because their lives may have been relatively normal. Yet it also may be the case that Jesus's family life was not exceptionally harsh among Jewish children who were fathered by Roman rapists, and he was exceptional among them primarily in prophetic consciousness of his predicament. Jesus's message was profoundly social because it was not just about him. While some of these children of rape probably became outcasts, others probably found a home among families who accepted them. It was the outcasts, however, that Jesus may have deliberately sought out among the Jewish population. While anyone born of a Jewish mother is considered Jewish by Mosaic law, Jesus's message was originally only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. If a shepherd has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. Matthew 18:12-13. This demonstrates a clear favoritism on Jesus's part, for lost sheep over the majority of his followers. Jesus's mission may have begun by going around to lands out of Nazareth in search of others like himself, other outcasts born of rape. Perhaps some of his core disciples were other half-Jews/half-Romans. If so, then Jesus cannot have been consistently against kin selection in practice, because this favoritism for lost sheep over the Jewish majority itself may have had a root in kin-selective altruism. This means, not that Jesus had any clear prejudice against those unlike himself. His disciples clearly included full ancestral Jews and possibly anyone else marginalized for whatever reasons. Jesus's values, however, were generalizations born of the situation he found himself. That Jesus deliberately sought those beyond the social borders of mainstream Judaism is a root of Christianity's transgression of the theological borders of Judaism. The marginal figures Jesus attracted probably began with outcast half-Roman Jews and generalized to the blind, the sick, the homeless, tax collectors, Samaritans, etc. The Samaritans were an ethnic and religious minority group outside of normative Judaism whose Jewish ancestral claims were disputed in the Talmud. They offer a perfect illustration of how the social conditions of outcast half-Jews were generalized to another roughly analogous social group. Contrasting the behavior of a despised but good Samaritan with the behavior of Pharisees following the law was a perfect parallel to attitudes towards a despised but virtuous member of Jesus's band of outcasts. Jesus was a pariah of a pariah people. This is the logical standing place of Christianity within Judaism. Christianity is like the Judaism of Judaism. Jesus, the half-Jew/half-Roman, caught up in the maelstrom of Jewish/Roman war, was something new that could not be fit into the old wineskins of Judaism. He became the vanguard of a new chosen people that came to be called Christians. Jesus imagined a kingdom where the first will be last, the last will be first, the somebodies will nobodies, the rulers will be servants, the commanders will be slaves, i.e. Matthew 18, verses 1 and 4, and the destitute king, Matthew 19:30. How would such a world really work? Jesus ate with whores. Love is desire, and universalizing love makes the undesirables desirable. Boundless love could make conceivable a world where the last will be first, and the first will be last, Matthew 20:16, the Omega Alpha and the Alpha Omega. The difference between Caesar and Christ is the difference between what I call the alpha altruism of Roman virtue and the omega altruism of Christian virtue. If duty to Rome pointed altruism upwards on the human social hierarchy, Christian omega altruism ensured a God-given license to direct altruism towards the very bottom of that social hierarchy. Caesar and Christ are opposites, yet mirrors of one another. This is no accident. The inordinate alpha altruism of a Roman soldier, subverted by Jesus's Jewish side, became the inordinate omega altruism of Christian love. The Jewish spirit that inverted Pharaoh's pyramid hierarchy so that Hebrew slaves ranked on top was turned against mainstream Judaism itself. Yet in directing omega altruism towards the bottom, he directed altruism towards himself as an inverse Caesar, a Caesar vulnerable to his own overthrow. The Lord maketh the earth waste, and turneth it upside down. The Lord shall punish the host of the high ones, and the kings of the earth upon the earth. Isaiah 24:20-21. The kingdom of God prescribes a radical fulfillment of the belief, the Lord preserveth the strangers, he relieveth the fatherless and the widow, but the way of the wicked he turneth upside down. Psalm 146:9. If Jesus was, in some ambiguous way, a stranger or a fatherless orphan, this meant that he was of special concern to God. Jesus exacerbated his outcast status as to become the most privileged of all and king of all. If the mighty will be brought down and the lowly raised up, i.e. Matthew 23:12, then, in literal terms, this upheaval might culminate in what modern people would call equality. Yet a mere redress or simple compensation would not begin to address the radical, systematic inequalities of a world exemplified by Rome's quest for world domination. To equal radical inequality, equality demands the radically unequal. Just as a king gets inordinate, unequal, and preferential treatment from subordinates who serve him, so would the sinners, the destitute, and the hapless stranger over the ordinary mass of people. A modern analogy would be something like affirmative action, except far more radical, systematic, preferential discrimination and privilege for those without a bourgeois work ethic or any other conventional claim to merit whatsoever. Like the prodigal son, i.e. Luke 15:11-32, who receives preferential, and by egalitarian standards, unjust treatment over his brother who did no wrong, the virtuous ones were the ones that trashed the corruption of Roman Jewish collaboration with the counter-corruption of moral leaven. The kingdom of God is the fruition of the deepest and most serious belief that with God all things are possible. To take God's kingdom seriously was only another way of affirming one's faith that God was the master and creator of the universe. If God was the author of nature, the creator and inventor of its rules, he could change those rules at will. This is what it means to be master of the universe. This is why the presence of God is said to be demonstrated through miracles. The kingdom of God is simply the masterpiece of all miracles, where God takes his reign, the hallmark of which is his demonstration of mastery over the nature of reality itself.